Hi friends, Cass here. I hope you're all doing well. Today is the last day in January and I wanted to wrap up my January reads for you guys. Overall, I had a pretty solid reading month. I found a new 5-star favorite at the beginning of the month, and the rest of the books that I read were just generally pretty good. I did not have any complaints about any of the books that I was reading, and I feel like that's all we can ask for. It was also a really large reading month for me. I read 10 books, and I feel like that's kind of, over the past couple years, been the maximum number of books that I've been able to read in one month. I think a big reason why I was able to read so many books this month was because I had pre-filmed a lot of my YouTube videos for the month of January, so I didn't really have to worry about working on any of the videos that were uploaded throughout the month, save for like one or two. So I feel like it was a really nice kind of reset to just be able to ease into the year, really focusing on the books that I was reading and not having to worry about doing other book-related things, if that makes sense. We are once again dealing with the whole wintertime sunsets at 5:30 p.m. thing, so trying yet another setup here, and I actually think that I like it with the bookshelves in the background, so maybe this setup will stick around. Other than that, I don't know what I was gonna say. Before we start talking about the books, I just wanted to say, if you are a fan of literary fiction, essays, memoirs, anything like that, that is what we talk about here. And I would love it if you subscribed and hung out in the comments with me. Also, just wanted to mention as well, I have a bookshop.org affiliate link down in the description. So if you are interested in any of the books that I talk about today, you can purchase them from there and support the channel if you feel so inclined. Other than that, we're going to start out with my Storygraph stats for the month of January. So like I said, I read 10 books equaling 2,395 pages. I read 70% fiction, 30% nonfiction. My notes say 70% fiction, 30% fiction. I think that it should be 70% fiction, 30% nonfiction. I read 5 books that I owned and already had on my shelves, 2 ARCs that were sent to me from the publishers, 2 books from the library, and 1 ebook from Everand. So I had a good mixture of different formats this month. I feel like sometimes I'll really get stuck in like one vibe of like specifically reading for my shelves or getting a ton of books out at the library or reading digitally. So it's nice to kind of use all of the different resources available to me throughout the course of one month. The first book that I read in January was A Woman's Story by Annie Ernaux. I rated this 4.5 stars. This book was translated from the French by Tanya Leslie, who I believe has translated a lot of Annie Ernaux's books. We're going to take advantage of the table thing and lean the book against the stack of books. So this book is a mixture of family history and memoir from Annie Ernaux. A lot of her books, the majority of her books, are memoirs, and this is no different, but it does focus in a little bit more on her mother specifically. Her mother passed away from Alzheimer's, and we watch Ernaux kind of sifting through the bits and pieces that she knows about her mother's life in an attempt to capture the real woman, the one who existed independently from me. So we do get some insight into the life of Ernaux herself, but we really are looking at her mother's own upbringing, the way that she raised Annie, as well as her life after Annie grew up and started a family of her own. The ending of the book chronicles her mother's final years in the geriatric ward of a hospital as she is declining mentally from Alzheimer's, and I thought that that part was especially touching. It was also something that hit really close to home for me personally with like my own family stuff, so it was really comforting to read about a similar situation and to just get one of my favorite writers' perspectives on something that my family is also going through. As always, the way that ernaux writes in this book is sharp and analytical. She kind of does something similar to Joan Didion in The Year of Magical Thinking in this, where you have that really like almost detached observational prose, and then that kind of contrasts with these glimpses of grief that the author lets you in on. And I just think that it makes those moments of grief so much more impactful. I really liked the way that ernaux explored the way that her relationship with her mother changed throughout the passage of time. There's sort of this mystique surrounding her mother's life before she had children. We see how much Annie just adored her mother whenever she was younger. And then there's also this undertone of resentment once her mother moves in with ernaux and her family in her later years in life. She says about her moving in with her family, "Suddenly my heart sank when I realized, from now on I shall have to live my whole life in front of her." And then there's also this kind of role reversal of ernaux having to care for her mother at the end of her life instead of being cared for by her. So yeah, this was a super short book, and I thought that it was a really great way to kick off my 2025 reading. As many of you know, I am working through all of Annie Ernaux's books. I'm hoping to do an author spotlight video on her at some point, hopefully in the first half of 2025, so keep an eye out for that. But yeah, this one is probably going to be close to the top of my list for that video. I'm loving not having to hold up the book the entire time that I'm talking about it. The next book that we're going to talk about is my 5-star read for the month, and that is I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Harpman. I have seen a lot of hype for this book online recently, and I was a little bit skeptical about it. I just didn't think that it was going to be the kind of book that works for me because it's a little bit more like sci-fi adjacent. I wouldn't say that it's like pure science fiction, but there definitely is a little something going on in this book. And yeah, I just was not expecting to be as blown away by this book as I was. I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with this book if you're in the same corner of the internet as I am, but this book follows the destinies of 40 women who were locked in a bunker. Us as readers don't know why they've been locked in the bunker, and neither do the women in the story. We have our narrator, who is a lot younger than the other 39 women that she's with. She has never known life outside of this prison that she's in. So her perspective is just a little bit different than the rest of the women that she's with, and I think that that makes for a very compelling way to move along the story. This is not a book that is going to give you any answers, so you have to be okay with that going into it. If you need like the full context explained, you're not going to get that here. The story is really bleak, but the writing is really sharp and precise, and we are just kind of propelled through this unknown with the narrator. I feel like maybe a better word to describe this book rather than sci-fi would be dystopian. There's almost this like alien quality to the setting and the situation, but I think that the ideas that Jacqueline Harpman is exploring in this book are really very much rooted in humanity. She's asking how we define what it means to be a person, how are our perceptions of time and memory altered by cruel and unusual circumstances. And yeah, I just think that the juxtaposition of the setting and the situation that these women find themselves in with these ideas that she's exploring, it's just very thought-provoking. So like I mentioned earlier, our narrator is younger. She has no memory of life outside of this bunker, so she only kind of has the really hazy memories of the other women to go off of. So the narrator has a very analytical approach to her survival, and she's very curious to know what the day-to-day normal lives of the women were like before they were in the bunker. It was really beautiful to see how the relationships between the narrator and the different women evolved and how they continuously adapted to their circumstances. I found the last line of this book especially to be incredibly haunting, and I just know that it's one that is going to stick with me for a while. So yeah, I'm really excited that I finally decided to pick it up. This was the book that I read on Everand as an ebook, but as you guys will see in an upcoming book haul, I did end up purchasing a copy of it after I read it because I liked it so much. And I have a quote. The narrator says, "Is there a satisfaction in the effort of remembering that provides its own nourishment, and is what one recollects less important than the act of remembering?" I also forgot to mention this book was translated from the French as well by Roz Schwartz. The next book that I read was Maps of Our Spectacular Bodies by Maddie Mortimer. This was a 4-star read for me. I thought that this book was really inventive and poetic. It is talking about a woman's personal history and her struggle with cancer. Our main character is named Leah. She is the mother of Iris and the wife of Harry, and she's just at the beginning of the book found out that her cancer has returned. This kind of sets us off into this spiral of reminiscing about people from her past and just like looking back on all of the events that have shaped her throughout her life. I felt really engaged with the plot of this book and really enjoyed the way that we uncovered more of Leah's story as the book progressed. There were some moments that are revealed from her past in here that genuinely shocked me. I also thought that the relationships between the characters were very nuanced. There is kind of this grandmother, mother, daughter trio with Leah, her mother Anne, and her daughter Iris. And I really liked seeing how their relationships with each other differed and the way that they interacted with each other. This book is quite long, but because of that, I had a chance to really get fully invested in the characters' lives, and I did cry a little bit at the end of this, so I feel like that is always a good sign, I guess. One of the interesting things that this book does is it includes the cancer's point of view as kind of a perspective in the story, and I thought that that was really intriguing. It does this thing where towards the beginning of the book, it speaks in the first person, so it's saying I. It's the separate entity from Leah, but as the book progresses and the disease gets worse, it switches to a we, and it just kind of shows how it took over more and more of Leah's body. I will say the writing style in this book was a little bit too flowery for me at times, but I do think that it made for a very earnest tone, which was quite touching. I think that it ended up all working together, but at some points it just wasn't my cup of tea as far as writing style. There are some really raw experiences in here, and I feel like that kind of language just did a much better job at conveying the emotions and the turmoil of the characters than like an Annie Ernaux type of prose, you know, super sparse. And yeah, this, like I said, is a longer book, and I found that instead of trying to stretch out my reading experience like I typically do with a long book, I felt really motivated to continue picking this book up and continue moving through the story. I felt very engaged with it, and I wasn't expecting that. It was a book that had a high likelihood of like not working out for me because of how it's written, but I think I just picked it up at the right time and it just worked out. Next is this little tiny book, The Illiterate by Agota Kristof. This was translated from the French as well by Nina Bogan, and this was a 4-star read for me as well. I read this in one night. It's very slim and very easy to just get through in one sitting. This book explores the idea of exile and language, and I actually feel like there is kind of a thread running throughout a lot of the books that I read this month, kind of this idea of displacement, whether that is literally being displaced from your country of origin or being displaced from your mind, like in the case of Annie Ernaux's mother in A Woman's Story, being displaced from your body, like in Maps of Our Spectacular Bodies. I feel like that is kind of an overarching theme for a lot of these books in a way. So yeah, this little book also includes an introduction by Helen Oyeyemi, as well as some endnotes. I found that those portions of the book were really helpful in getting a deeper understanding of what the author was doing here. She is talking about her upbringing in Hungary and her exile to Switzerland during the 1956 revolution. She was forced to learn Russian when she was a child because the Soviet Union took over. And then whenever she fled to Switzerland, she was forced to learn French at the age of 21. So a lot of this book deals with the difficulties of communicating in her new country and the silence that kind of fell upon the Hungarian refugees because they kind of lost their native language. I thought that the way that she discussed her decision about what language to write in was really interesting as well. She wrote this book in French, and she says, "I did not choose this language. It was imposed upon me by fate, by chance, by circumstance." So the prose in here is really sparse. There's not really any adjectives, and she leaves out any sort of experiences that aren't rooted in reality and things that actually happened to her. And that really reflects the loss of her mother tongue when she was in exile. Helen Oyeyemi does a really good job of talking about this in the introduction, and there's just so much interplay between the language itself and the form in this book, so it was really thought-provoking. I also really appreciated the fact that I got to learn about a period in history that I was not very familiar with. I have a quote from this one as well. She says, "What would my life have been like if I hadn't left my country? More difficult, poorer, I think, but also less solitary, less torn. Happy, maybe. What I am certain of is that I would have written, no matter where I was, and no matter what language." This is one that I haven't really seen anyone talk about, and I feel like it would be up a lot of people's alleys if you're watching this channel, so I would really recommend that you guys check this one out. My next read was a new release from Hogarth that came out this month, and that is Good Girl by Aria Aber. Thank you so much to Hogarth and Jacqueline for sending me the finished copy of this book, as well as the Good Girl hat. Very exciting package to receive in the mail. I rated this book 3.5 stars. It follows a 19-year-old girl named Nyla. She is of Afghan heritage, and she's living in Germany. Her mother passed away when she was young, and that really kind of splintered her relationship with her family, and especially with her father. As she gets older, she kind of falls into the nightlife crowd of Berlin. The group that she's hanging out with centers around this older American writer named Marlowe, and him and Nyla have some romantic entanglements with each other. And we see Nyla grapple with the shame that she has surrounding her Afghan identity. Once again, this kind of sense of displacement that she feels among her friends because she has a different background from them, and the way that that shame that she's feeling drags her even further away from her family. I really enjoyed the writing style in this book. Aria has a multilingual background, and she's also a poet, so that just made for some really interesting turns of phrase. I thought that the narrative voice was really engaging as well, and I was just rooting for our main character the entire time. I wanted better for her the whole book. I think that the struggles that she was facing felt really realistic, and there was nuance to what she was going through. I also thought that this book really excelled in evoking a sense of time and place. We have all these descriptions of the Berlin club scene in the 2000s, and I just felt like I was there. There are some major scenes that happen between Nyla and Marlowe that I felt really compelled by, but overall, I've mentioned this talking about other books as well, I just don't think that I love reading about a toxic relationship. That, paired with the constant partying of the characters, just kind of started to grate on me a little bit towards the end of the book. I feel like that kind of cyclical nature of the benders that Nyla and Marlowe go on and their on again, off again relationship, it was a little bit similar to If Only by Vigdis Hjorth, and I would have just liked to see some of the repetition tightened up a little bit personally. Overall, it was a really enjoyable debut novel, and I'm really happy to have received it. My next read was Promising Young Women by Suzanne Scanlon. This was a 4-star read for me. I picked this up because last spring I had read Suzanne Scanlon's memoir, Committed on Meaning in Mad Women, and I absolutely devoured that book when I read it last spring, so I wanted to check out more of her books. Promising Young Women is a really fragmentary, fictionalized account of the events of that memoir, basically. It talks about Scanlon's time in and out of a psychiatric institution. We get glimpses of her childhood when her mother passed away, her college years, the narrator's own experiences with motherhood later on in life, as well as the lives of some of the other women that are in the ward with her. The timelines aren't always super clear in this book as far as like what's happening when, but the emotions that are conveyed are very clear. I think that Committed, the memoir, is the stronger book overall. I think it's a little bit more fleshed out than this one, but this is a really quick and engaging read, and you can really see how, it was published back in 2012, and I feel like it really laid the groundwork for Committed to be published. You can kind of see the formation of that memoir in this novel. There is a chapter in this book called The Closest Thing that talks about the narrator's mother's funeral, and that one was a very touching chapter to read. I felt very affected by that one, so I wanted to shout that one out, but I'm really excited to continue on with reading her 37th Year and Index, which is the other book that she's published, and I can't wait to see what Suzanne Scanlon publishes in the future. I think that her story is very moving, and I just really enjoy the way that she works through the experiences that she's had through writing. Next, we have my before bed reading for the majority of the month. That was the Paris Review. This is the fall 2024 edition. I believe it's number 249. I was considering getting a subscription to the Paris Review, even though I had never read one of these magazines before, and I decided to buy this copy at Barnes & Noble first to see if it would be worth it for me to get a subscription. I'm glad that I bought this one to try out first before just like jumping straight into the subscription. I just feel like I'm not at a point in my life where I need this to come to my house 4 times a year. I really appreciate what they're doing as far as, showcasing writers and like the interviews and stuff. Like, I don't know, I think it's really cool what they're doing, but I think that it would be more beneficial for me to just purchase an edition of this if there's something that I'm very interested in specifically reading. They're just such beautiful objects that I'm like, I want to have a collection of them, but I don't think that the subscription is the right avenue for me at this moment. Next up, we have another new release from Hogarth as well, and that is We Do Not Part by Hong Kong. She recently won the Nobel Prize, and this book has just been getting so much hype. It's just been a very exciting book release to get to witness. I rated this one 3.5 stars. It is a really kind of hazy spiral into a dark part of Korean history. This was the perfect time of year to read this book. We've gotten so much snow here in Pittsburgh, and we had some like negative temperatures going on, and this book is mainly set in the cold and the snow, so it was very much in line with my current setting. Similar to The Illiterate, I really appreciate that Hong Kong is shedding some light on a part of history that is not really widely talked about. This talks about the Jeju massacre that occurred in Korea, which I wasn't familiar with before reading this book, so I did end up doing some research into it as I was reading just to get a better grasp of what was going on in the story. The book centers around 2 friends, and one of them gets in an accident. Is that a spoiler? One of them gets in an accident and needs the other to go to her home on Jeju Island to rescue her pet bird, who is like without a caretaker. It turns into this very meandering, almost dreamlike story. Like, I have a very difficult time describing what happens in this book. We uncover a lot of bits and pieces of history, and it seems like the more history we uncover, the less certain we are about what is like actually going on in the story. It seems like our narrator kind of loses her grasp on what is real and what is happening. I think that Hong Kong does a really like respectful job of portraying the atrocities that occurred in Korea during this event without being like too gratuitous with her descriptions of the violence. And I really like the way that we uncover information throughout the course of the book. She uses documentaries and newspaper clippings, and I really liked how the form kind of changed throughout. I also thought that the friendship that the book centers around was really touching to read. I think for me, I just wanted a little bit more of a resolution to the storyline that was occurring in the present day in the book. And I just found that some of the like uncertainty and dreamlike nature of the book made it difficult for me to get engaged at times. But I really do appreciate the opportunity to learn about a part of history that I wasn't familiar with, especially from a Nobel Prize winner. So very grateful to Hogarth for sending this one over. Our last two books are my library reads for the month. We have How to Read Now by Elaine Castillo. This was a 4-star read for me. I thought that this one was super thought-provoking. It is nonfiction, it's an essay collection, and Elaine is exploring the ways that we can engage more deeply with the works that we consume, and she's looking at how we can better take ethics and politics into consideration, just so that we can think more critically about the way that we're seeing literature and art and things like that. I thought that this book was really in line with my own goals for reading, as far as reading more diversely and engaging more critically with books. And it also feels very poignant for the period of time that we're living in right now with the second Trump administration starting. This was released in 2022, and there is quite a bit of reflection on the first administration. So it just felt very resonant to what is going on, unfortunately. I think that her voice in this book is so fresh and witty, and it really made for a fun reading experience. It's a very educational book, but also just really enjoyable because of the way that she writes. She pulls in a wide array of literature and film and TV shows and examines all of these things through this lens of the unexpected reader. She is Filipina, and she talks about how a lot of the things in mainstream white American culture are not created with someone like her in mind. I just thought that it was a really important lens to look at these works through. This book was specifically recommended to me because there's an essay about Joan Didion in here, and I really appreciated that piece and how it was so well crafted and well researched, and just brought up a lot of things that I hadn't thought about when talking about Joan Didion and Californian history. Yeah, I thought that this was a really great piece of contemporary criticism, and just such a good reminder for us to take a deeper look at the art that we're interacting with. I do have a quote for this one as well. She says, "It became patently obvious that much of our literary industry functions as little more than a quaint pastime for its adherents, a place to merely cosplay diversity, empathy, education. Not a place to be truly diverted from oneself, not a place to be made humble in one's vulnerability, not a place to be laid bare in one's unknowing." Will it stand up on its own? No. My final book of the month was The Wren by Enright. This was another 4-star read for me. I decided to pick this one up after hearing Kat's Field Notes talk about it over the summer whenever she was traveling through Ireland and talking about Irish literature on her channel. This book follows 3 generations of an Irish family. At the center of everything, we have Carmel. She's the daughter of Phil, who was kind of an absent father as well as a poet. And then we have Carmel's daughter, Nell, who is a 20-something, kind of trying to figure things out. We see how Paul leaving the family affected both of the women. They're both kind of trying to navigate their complicated feelings towards their father and grandfather, as well as their feelings towards men in general. Carmel decides to raise Nell as a single mother in order to protect herself from potentially being left by a man, and throughout the book they both kind of embark on these hit or miss relationships with men. I also really liked the mother-daughter relationship between Carmel and Nell. I thought that that was realistic and compelling, and just enjoyed seeing their interactions. We get perspectives from all three of those main characters in this book, and I feel like the voice of each one of them just felt so distinct. You could really see the generational divide between the family members through their interactions with each other and their relationships to nature and technology. I think that Anne Enright's voice in general just felt very fresh, and I feel like I now see what you guys mean whenever you talk about how unique Irish literature is. It's not really a country that I've read a ton of books from, I don't think. But I'm understanding the hype behind it. I felt really engaged by the way that she was playing with language. It almost kind of gave me Ali Smith in a good way, but it was maybe a little bit more like rough around the edges to me. There is poetry incorporated in between the chapters, which makes sense because the grandfather in this book is a poet. The poetry was pretty nice to read, but I also felt like the book would have been completely fine without it. I don't think that it really added to or took away from my enjoyment of the book. So yeah, overall, I feel like this was an enjoyable read. It was a unique take on a story about family that could have veered off into like very just like typical territory, like nothing to write home about, but I think that Enright's voice was what really like set this apart and made it stand out. All right, here we have it, the 10 books that I read in January. I hope that this was a good reading month for you guys as well. I feel like January is always kind of hit or miss for people. I feel like it's either really good or really bad. So let me know if you found any new favorites this month. Let me know if you've read any of these books, what your thoughts were on them, and I will talk to you guys in the next one. Bye!